All right, I'd like to start with a story. And the story is about Team Sky, which is Great Britain's professional cycling team. Sometime in the mid-2000s, around 2010, they hired a man named Dave Brailsford. And at the time, Team Sky had a very middle-of-the-road record when it came to performance on the world stage. They had won about one gold medal in the last 100 years, from 1908 to 2008. They had never won a Tour de France, the premier event in cycling. And when they hired Dave Brailsford, they said, we would like to change this. We'd like to improve our performance. We'd like to reach a higher level of performance. What's your plan to help us do that? And when they hired Brailsford, he said, I have this strategy called the aggregation of marginal gains. And the way that he described it was the 1% improvement in nearly everything that you do. And so they started by looking at a lot of things you would expect a cycling team to look at. They improved their bike tires and made them slightly lighter. They put a more ergonomic seat on the bike. They had their riders wear biofeedback sensors so they could see how each person responded to the training and practice that they did each day. They had their outdoor riders wear indoor racing suits because they were lighter and more aerodynamic. But then they did a variety of things that you wouldn't expect a cycling team to do. They split tested different types of massage gels to see which one led to the best form of recovery. They taught their riders how to wash their hands to reduce the risk of infection and keep them healthy. They even figured out what kind of pillow led to the best night's sleep for each rider and then brought that on the road with them to hotels. So Brailsford said, if we can actually execute on this strategy, if we can aggregate all these small changes, these little 1% improvements, then I think we can win the Tour de France in about 5 years. He ended up being wrong. They won the Tour de France in 3 years, and then they repeated again the fourth year with a different rider, and then just last year they won for the third time in 4 years. And Brailsford's strategy really came to fruition at the Olympics in London in 2012 when they won 70% of the gold medals available. And so what I'd like to start us off with is the idea that small improvements actually can add up to a very significant change in a relatively short period of time. And this is just basic math, all right? If you get 1% better each day over 365 days, you end up 37 times better at the end of the year. If you get 1% worse, you take yourself almost all the way down to zero. And this idea that 1% improvements are not just nice to have or not just a nice little bonus, but actually something significant that adds up to a very substantial increase in the long run is the place that I'd like to start us at today. Now, you might say, okay, well, 1% improvements are nice, but clearly no one is going to get 1% better every single day. So is that ever enough to accumulate to anything, considering that we're not going to be perfect all the time? And I would argue, yes. In fact, you can get 10 times better if you get 1% better 5 days a week, 46 weeks a year, so it's about 230 days in total. That gives you 6 weeks off for holidays, illness, laziness, and just generally not getting things done. But you're still 10 times better at the end of the year. And what I would like to propose is that the way to do this is not by setting better goals for ourselves or at our organizations, but by building better systems and obtaining better habits. In fact, you could say that the system had always been there for Brailsford and Team Sky. The goal had always been there. The goal had never changed. They wanted to win a Tour de France each year. They wanted to win Olympic gold medals. It wasn't the goal that made the difference. Instead, it was their system, the way that they applied those improvements in a 1% basis day after day. So, the remainder of this talk is about how to do that. How to do that for ourselves, how to do that in our organizations. How do we make those 1% changes tangible, possible, and real in the environments that we're in each day? The key idea here is that the biggest surprise about these small systemic changes, about these tiny habits, is that they add up to something very significant and meaningful. In order to do this, to talk about how to build these better habits, how to build these better systems, I'm going to take what I'm going to call an inside-out approach. We'll start by focusing on the psychology of the individual, the psychology of you, and we'll gradually work out from our mindset and the things that we believe and the way that our mind works to the environment that we surround ourselves with each day and the team members that we're surrounded by at work and in organizations. I want to thank a few people who've influenced my work in a substantial way. BJ Fogg, Leo Babauta, Nira Yal, Kelly McGonigal, Dan Party, and Scott Adams. Their work has influenced everything that I'll share in this presentation. I think it's important to cite them. And I also have a long list of other people who have influenced my work at jamesclear.com/thanks. So, part one, mindset. There was a study done at Yale University on the psychology of aging. And it was a 23-year study. They talked to people, and they basically went into one of two cohorts. The first cohort had positive views of aging. So when they asked them how they felt about aging or what their expectations were for old age, they had relatively good things to say. I would be moving into the prime of my life, or I'll be smarter than I've ever been before. They were very positive about it. The second group was very negative about it. My body's going to wear down. I don't have much to look forward to. Everybody gets sick. We'll all die at some point, that type of thing. What they found was that of the 660 adults in the study, the ones with positive views of aging lived, on average, 7.6 years longer. And that actually is a very significant number. Things like exercise and diet don't account for 7.6 years in life expectancy. So why, if your view is positive? The reason is because you'll take healthy actions as a result, and if your view is negative, you'll assume that deterioration of your health is inevitable. If you have a positive view of aging, you'll say something like, well, I should continue to eat healthy and work out because I feel good about moving into old age. I still have a lot to live for. Whereas if you have a negative view of aging, you'll say something like, what's the point in me exercising? I'm going to get sick anyway. I'm expecting to get old, and so on. The point here is that there's a deeper level of behavior change and habit formation than what we often discuss. And the way that I would describe it is this. The outer layer of behavior change are the results that we get, the outcome, the goal. So that's the outside layer. Often, we say we need better goals. We need better outcomes. We need better results. We need to hit new sales numbers. And so to do that, we take one step in on behavior change and we talk about our actions. Now, the actions and the results are usually where we stop when it comes to habits and behavior change. We say, how can we build better habits? How can we take action on this particular goal? How can we take an action to get a result? But I would argue, and that Yale study would prove this, that there's a deeper level of behavior change as well. And that level is identity or belief or mindset. You can take your pick of what you'd like to term it. But the identity that we hold drives the actions that we take and the results that we get. So in the Yale study, the people have a positive identity when it comes to aging. They believe that they should take positive actions, and thus they get better results in the long run. We'll take a common example when it comes to personal habits, weight loss. So losing 20 pounds or 10 kilos over the next 6 months, that'll be the outer layer, okay? That'll be the result that you're going for. In order to lose those 10 kilos, you need to move in to the actions that you take. And so that would be something like working out 3 times a week or eating healthy. But most people stop there, and they don't shift the underlying identity that drives the behavior. So, for example, in this case, the identity might be, I want to become the type of person who doesn't miss workouts. And my argument is, if we focus just on the identity, if you become the type of person who doesn't miss workouts, if you become the type of person who exercises consistently, and only focus on the core of behavior change, it ripples out to the other layers anyway. So, the key idea here is that a shift in mindset leads to a shift in daily choices. And a shift in daily choices leads to significantly better results in the long run. All right, part 2, priorities. I actually think this is the most text I'll have on any slide, but I think it's a great quote. The word priority came into the English language in the 1400s. It was singular. It meant the first or very prior thing, and it stayed singular for the next 500 years. Only in the 1900s did we pluralize the term and start talking about priorities. Illogically, we reasoned that by changing the word, we could bend reality, and somehow we would now have multiple first things. You hear about this a lot in organizations. They'll talk about priority 1, priority 2, priority 3, priority 4. Everything is a priority, everything is an urgency, even though it's not possible for us to focus on more than one thing at a time. So this second section on priorities, you could also call it ruthless elimination. And when it comes to building better habits and changing behavior in organizations and in our personal lives, we have to be ruthless about the things that we focus on. So in order to talk about this some more and talk about the importance of simplifying, why should we only have one priority than 3 or 4 or 5, I'd like to talk about a psychological concept called the Zeigarnik effect. The Zeigarnik effect is best illustrated by a story from Germany in the 1920s. There were a group of men that went into a restaurant, and there were about 4 of them. They sat down to have lunch, and their waiter came up and took their orders and remembered them all without writing any of it down. And it was a relatively complex order, so when he came back and the food was wonderful and it was exactly what they ordered, they were impressed. They were impressed that he could remember everything that they had told them for the order. And so they finished their meal, they got up out of the restaurant and walked down the street, and one of the men realized that he left his wallet at the restaurant. So he turned around, went back in, and flagged down the waiter and said, I'm sorry, I forgot my wallet. Do you know where it is? I leave it at the table. And the waiter looked at him and said, I'm sorry, who are you? And he said, you just waited on us. We were really impressed with your memory. You remembered our entire order. We were just here. And the waiter said, oh, I only remember each order until it's filled. And the lesson here is that the Zeigarnik effect is this tendency that we have to experience intrusive thoughts about something that we're working on, an objective that was once pursued and left incomplete. So if you have projects at your work that are half finished, these things are open loops in your mind, and it's like a nagging brain, right? It creates this curiosity gap or this gap in your brain for all the things that you have not finished yet. And I would argue that our brains are often like, it's like a computer. There's only a certain amount of memory available, right? And so for each open task that is left unfinished, you drain the percentage of memory that you have available for the other tasks that you're working on. So the more unfinished tasks that you have available, the more priorities that you have at any one time, the more open loops that you have, the less percentage of memory and power and attention and focus that you can deliver to the thing that you're working on at any given time. It's the Zeigarnik effect in action. We actually have some good data on this. There was a study of a parole board judges, and there were about 1,000 of them, 1,000 cases that they looked at in this particular research study. And the parole board judges would have criminals come out. They would sit before the parole board, and then they would vote on whether or not they would be released from prison or would have to go back in. What you would hope, is that in order for a criminal to get released from prison, it should be based on the time they served, the type of crime that they did, whether or not they had good behavior, all sorts of things built into the criminal justice system. In fact, what they found, the single biggest factor on whether or not someone was released on parole or whether they had to go back into prison was the time of day that they were seen. So this is a map of the judge's decisions throughout the day. You can see that in the beginning of the day, it starts around 60% likelihood that a criminal would be released on parole. As the morning goes on, the judges get fatigued, their willpower depletes, and the odds of you getting a favorable hearing decreases. That first dotted line is lunch. So they take a break, the judge's decision-making spikes right back up to where it was before, then goes back down, they take another break in the afternoon, and then pretty soon it just falls off the cliff and the day ends. Now, this idea is a psychological concept called decision fatigue, or ego depletion, you'll sometimes hear it called. And the point here is that the more decisions that we make over the course of a day, the more your willpower and focus gets fatigued. It's kind of like a muscle, right? If I were to pick up that weight and do curls for a little while, I can do them for a minute or two, but if you catch me 30 minutes from now, I'm not going to have much left. And that's how our willpower works as well. So, you can basically say that our motivation level fluctuates throughout the day. So if we're looking to build better habits in our organizations, if you have a project that you or your team is trying to work on, you have one of two decisions you can make. You either can pick a very difficult thing to work on and hope that you stack it at the correct time of day when your willpower is high enough to perform that action, or you can pick a habit that's so easy that you can't say no to it regardless of how depleted or exhausted or tired you are throughout the day. So the solution is either to maximize the time at which you try to do a difficult project or to break things down into a simple manner that you can actually stick with regardless of where your willpower is at any given moment. So the key idea here is your brain only has so much capacity to provide. Your willpower is like a muscle, and similar to muscles, it gets fatigued. So we need to understand this about ourselves and about the people on our teams if we want to stick to good habits and build consistent systems in the long run. The way that I would describe it is that we often assume that as humans we are like a tree and we can grow wider and taller and bigger, and we have infinite energy to give to things. We take on more projects, we take on more priorities, we take on more responsibilities. But in fact, we're much more like a rose bush. A rose bush is relatively confined in its shape and size. It's not that big, and it can't grow wider and taller. And in order for a rose bush to fully blossom, for a few of the flowers to actually bloom to their full potential and flourish, you have to trim away many of the buds. And so by trimming away good ideas, you make room for the great ideas to flourish. We're much more like a rose bush than we are like a tree. All right, let me give you some practical ideas on how to do this. It's great to say that we need to simplify, but how do we actually make that happen in the real world? So Warren Buffett, one of the most famous investors of our time, he adheres to a concept that I'll call the 25-5 rule. And this story comes from a man named Mike Flint, who was Warren Buffett's private pilot. Mike Flint has flown multiple U.S. presidents. He's also the pilot for Warren Buffett. So he's had a very successful career. And he came to Warren Buffett one day and he said, "Warren, I would like to fly this particular type of plane. I think whenever we upgrade, we should get this new one." And he said, "Mike, if you're working for me in 10 years when we buy a new plane, then I probably have failed you as a boss. So here's what I'd like you to do. And this exercise that I'm about to share, you can do on any level. You can do it for your career. You can do it for the things that you or your team need to get done this month. You can do it for the things that you need to work on today or this week." And he said, "I'd like you to take the 25 things that you want to achieve in your career and write them down on a list." So Mike Flint goes away, writes down his 25 things. He gets done and he says, "All right, great. I want you to circle the top 5 things on that list." So he spends some more time. He circles the top 5 priorities. He says, "All right, tell me what your strategy is at this point." And Mike Flint said, "Well, I have my top 5 things, so I'm going to work on those first." And he said, "Great, what about the other things on your list?" He said, "Well, those will be the things I do on nights or weekends or when I get tired or bored or, a project stalls. I'll work on that." And Warren Buffett said, "Mike, you got it all wrong. The things that you have circled are your priorities. The other items on your list, numbers 6 through 25, this is your never do under any circumstance list." And the reason is because it's so easy for us to rationalize spending time on things that are good uses of time but not great uses of time. It's items that 6 through 25 on your list that take up time and space and energy because we can justify why we need to do them. They're on the list for a reason. They just don't happen to be the best uses of our time. And so I would encourage you to take that exercise and think about how you can apply it to the work that you're doing or the professional or personal priorities that you have. There's another way that we can do this, and I have a digital version of this. If you want to download it, it's free. It's just a Google spreadsheet that lays out these 4 grids just at jamesclear.com/ebox. But it's called the Eisenhower box. Dwight Eisenhower was a U.S. president who used this concept way back in the 1940s and 1950s. And basically, we have 4 quadrants that we can define our tasks in. We have things that are urgent, and we have things that are not urgent, and we have things that are important and things that are not important. Now, if something's urgent and important, if it's in the do box, it's very easy to know that you need to do it. It's urgent, so you're going to work on it right away, and it's important, so there's not much debate. However, the things in quadrant 2, the things that are important but are never urgent, these are the things that are really hard to convince yourself to do. Because you know that you should be doing them, but they're never urgent enough to make it onto your to-do list. So for these, we need to decide or schedule a time to do it. For the things that are not important, but they're urgent, these are the things that take up our time and space, the fires that we try to put out each day, the things that come into your inbox and you end up responding to someone else's agenda rather than your own. These are the things that we need to delegate or to at least box. If we're not going to delegate to someone else, let's delegate it to a different time of our day so that we're in control of it rather than being the victim of the things that come into our lives, the urgencies and emergencies that are thrown into us. And then finally, we have things that are not urgent and not important. And I would imagine most people in this room don't have a lot of those because you're fairly productive, but there are plenty of things that end up creeping into our lives that don't serve us. And so we need to delete those out of our daily schedules. Now, the key idea here is that busy does not equal important. Urgent is not the same thing as necessary. So we need to filter out the fluff, whether it's through the 25-5 rule or just recognizing the Zeigarnik effect in our own lives so that we can focus on what matters. Now, part 3, let's talk about triggers. I call this the 3 R's of habit formation. You'll see it labeled with different terms depending on where you're at or what you're reading. This is mentioned in The Power of Habit, which is a good book, a good primer on this little loop. But the basic idea is that no matter what habit you're working on, there are 3 main steps based on the research. The first step is the prompt or the cue or the trigger. It's like a reminder, the thing that signals that we should do something. So if my phone buzzes, for example, that's a trigger. The next piece is the routine. This is the behavior itself, the actual habit that you're going to perform. So my phone buzzes, that's the trigger. I answer the phone, that's the routine. The third piece is the reward. So this is the benefit that you get for doing the behavior. And it's important to note that all habits, good or bad, have some kind of benefit or reward associated with them. Take smoking, for example. People will often label smoking as a bad habit, so what's the benefit? What's the reward of it? Well, there's some kind of physiological reward. There's a hit of nicotine that's associated with it. And then there are often social rewards, right? You get to share a smoke with a friend or a colleague, something like that. So regardless of how we label habits or behaviors, the important thing is to note that all of them have some kind of benefit neurologically associated with them. Now, so my phone rings, that's a reminder. I answer the phone, that's the routine. And then I get to satisfy my curiosity or find out who's calling, that's the benefit. And what ends up happening is that if that reward is positive, then it tells your brain, hey, remember, next time this reminder happens, next time this trigger comes along, we should repeat that pattern. And once you make it through the cycle enough times, it becomes a habit, it becomes ingrained. So, how can we leverage the first part of this, the trigger or the reminder? Well, there are 5 types of triggers in our lives: time, location, preceding event, emotional state, and other people. Now, let's go through how to structure your day and some of these triggers to make new habits more likely, to make it more likely that we'll follow through in the long run. So, the first distinction that I'd like to make is between a cold trigger and a hot trigger. A cold trigger is something that you're told to do or something that's supposed to trigger new behavior, but you cannot act on it right now. So, for example, if you're walking down the street outside of this building and you see a sign that says, go visit jamesclear.com, you can't go there right away. You need to remember, next time I get in front of a computer, I should go visit jamesclear.com. So it's a cold trigger. You can't act on it. Meanwhile, if I send you a text message and say, hey, did you see this link at jamesclear.com? and send you a link to the article, you can click on it right away. That's a hot trigger. A hot trigger can be acted upon immediately. The important thing to note is that as much as possible in our teams and in our personal lives, we should try to build hot triggers for the tasks that we are asking people to do, because hot triggers can be acted on right away. If you just give people cold triggers for the tasks that they're asked to do, it's hard for them to take action. And this also has a very widely applicable point for consumer behavior and consumer psychology. I know we have a variety of people working on tech companies here. If you imagine a user coming to a particular user interface or to a particular piece of software, you need to give them hot triggers that allow them to act upon right away, whatever the thing is that you're asking them to do. So, B.J. Fogg, who's a professor at Stanford, says, in his estimation, this is the key to behavior change. Put hot triggers in the path of motivated people. And that's all you really need to do if you want to drive behavior in a significant way. All right, let's talk about how to do this. So this is what I call the T-chart exercise. It's a very basic exercise. You're going to have a piece of paper and you'll have 2 columns. In the first column, you're going to list out all the things that you do each day without fail. So usually there's a big group of behaviors in the beginning of your day. For example, I wake up, I go to the bathroom, I take a shower, I get changed, I brush my teeth, I eat breakfast, I make my morning cup of coffee, and so on. There's another batch of behaviors usually when you get into work and around lunchtime. You may have like a bedtime routine or dinner behaviors, but whatever it is, you're going to try to, in as much detail as possible, write out all the things that you do each day without fail. Then, in column 2, next to it, you're going to write all the things that happen to you each day without fail. So the sun rises, the sun sets, a traffic light turns green, a traffic light turns red, you receive a text message, a song comes on the radio, somebody sends you an email, all of these things that are happening to you. Finally, what we're going to do is think about the new behavior that you want to instill in your team, in yourself, your personal life, whatever it is, and then find the trigger on the list that best matches with the new behavior that you're trying to build. And what I mean by match is not the same type of behavior, but it's in this proper sequence to add the behavior in. So let me give you an example. Let's say that I wanted to start meditating, okay? I could say, I write out all the things that I'm doing each day and they're happening to me each day, and then I realize, all right, in the morning, I make a cup of coffee. And so for this new behavior, I could say, when I make my morning cup of coffee, I will meditate for 60 seconds. And so the current behavior, the things that you're already doing that are listed on this T-chart, become the trigger for the new behavior that you're trying to build. And the reason that this is important is that your current behaviors, things that are already habits, have this neurological network built into your mind. They already have like an on-ramp in your brain. And so you're just kind of tapping into that so that you can tag the new behavior and link it to something that's already strongly correlated in your mind. All right, let's talk about other ways to make building new habits easier. I think David Allen spoke at Stretch last year or 2 years ago, and he has a concept that he calls the 2-minute rule. And the way that he describes it is the 2-minute rule is anything that takes less than 2 minutes, you should do it right away. So making a phone call back that you've been putting off, sending that email that you've been avoiding, throwing the laundry in, washing the dishes, whatever it is, if it takes less than 2 minutes, just do it right away. Take out the trash and so on. Now, I think we can adapt that rule for habits and behavior change. There is no habit that we're going to work on that takes less than 2 minutes to do. But nearly any habit can be started in under 2 minutes. So if you take exercise, for example, often people will get home from a long day of work and they say, I'm too exhausted to go for a run or to try to exercise. So I never get around to doing it because I think about, I have to run, 5 kilometers or whatever, some long distance that seems overwhelming to me. So rather than focus on the whole thing that you need to do, I would encourage you to focus on just the first 2 minutes. So what's the first 2 minutes of that habit? I put my running shoes on, I get out the door, and I lock the door. And if you do just that, it doesn't matter if you take another step. But what you find is that motivation often comes after starting, not before. We often think that motivation is something that we're supposed to have before we do work. But motivation will come as a result of doing some small bit of work, and then we can trust that the rest of the process will flow easily. Another way that we could put it is that you basically start with this 3-step process. Start with a habit that is incredibly easy for you, so small that you can't say no to it. Then increase your habit, but in a very small way. And third, keep it easy and break down the habit as needed. This also is from BJ Fogg. His program, Tiny Habits, is free, I believe, if you want to check it out. I think it's pretty good. It does a good job of breaking down some of these behavior change principles. But the point here is that the motivation needed to complete a habit is at its peak at the beginning of a behavior. The greatest amount of friction for any type of task is in the beginning, is in the starting. But as soon as you start the habit, it's so much easier to follow through. Let's take that running example that I was just giving. How hard is it to start running when you haven't started at all, compared to after you've already run 3 kilometers and you're running 5 in total? Well, once you're halfway there, you're like, I might as well run back. I got to go back anyway, right? You need almost no motivation to finish the task once it's begun. So the point here is that by reducing the amount of friction in the beginning of the behavior with the 2-minute rule, you make it more likely that you'll actually follow through with the whole thing in the long run. So the key idea is make it so easy that you can't say no. All right, here's another way to do this. It's a concept called pre-commitment. It's been very well researched, and I call these kind of like instant willpower improvements. They're things that seem very simple, but we often ignore or don't put into practice, and if we do put them into practice, they result in immediate boosts in willpower, and I'll share a couple studies showing that. So basically, we're often paralyzed by having too many choices. If everything's available to us, then we freeze because we don't know what the best choice is. And so we say, well, rather than make the wrong decision, I'll just wait and not make any decision. We can use pre-commitment to overcome this. Here's one study. A random sample of a business with 3,272 employees. The business wanted their employees to get their annual flu shot. Now, to do this, they sent them a flyer that said, you need to get your flu shot. But then they sent us another version, and that other version said, you need to get a flu shot. Your appointment has already been scheduled for April 22nd. Click here or send us a message here to choose the time that you want to attend. And what they found was just by selecting a date, just by picking the day when people would get it, they were 2.4 times more likely to follow through. But then they sent a third version, and they said, you need to get your flu shot. You've already been scheduled for 1 p.m. on April 22nd. If you need to change the time, you can click here and do so. And the people who had the exact time and date scheduled for them were 4 times more likely to follow through, simply because they were pre-committed. And we often think, oh, we should give people more options. We should let them choose whatever they want to do. But if we're trying to incentivize behavior, if we're trying to make it more likely for people to follow through, pre-commitment is a great device for doing this. All right. So in other words, setting this default behavior led to a 12% increase in flu vaccinations overall for the whole company. There we go. Okay, so implementation intentions is another method, very similar to pre-commitment, but slightly different. And this is the study that I like that shows this. So there was a study that looked at different groups and their motivation and ability to stick with exercise. So there are 3 groups in this study. The first group, they brought in and they said, we want you to track how often you exercise over the next 2 weeks. So that's group 1. Group 2, they said, we want you to track how often you exercise, and we're going to show you this motivational video about the benefits of exercise, why you should do it. So group 2 was the motivated group, all right? Then there was group 3. Group 3 got the exact same treatment as group 2. They were told to track their exercise. They were given the motivational speech. They were equally motivated, but they did one thing differently. And that one thing is they filled out this sentence that said, during the next week, I will partake in at least 20 minutes of vigorous exercise on this day, at this time, at this place. And what they found when they looked at all the analysis at the end of the study is this is what happened. Group 1, 38% of them worked out over the next 2 weeks. The control group, no motivation. Group 2, remember, they were the motivated group, and the motivation faded almost as immediately, as soon as they walked out of the research lab. So 35% of them worked out. And group 3, it was almost double or even triple the odds that they would work out over the next 2 weeks. 91% of them stuck to exercise. And the only difference was that they filled out this little sentence. And it seems so basic, but by pre-committing ourselves to things, we make it much more likely that we follow through. If you're interested, implementation intentions, which is what this is called, this is an implementation intention. There are hundreds of studies on this, so it's been proven in a bunch of different contexts. It's very simple, and it's something that actually leads to real results. All right. So the important idea here is that you need to pick a time and a space for your goals to live, right? Pick a date, pick a time, choose a place, make this a reality in your world and in your schedule. Now, you may be saying, all right, that's great. I should just pick times and places for everything that I want to work on. But in fact, we can get really overloaded by the amount of things that we want to improve, right? There are all sorts of things that you may want to improve upon. So how do you decide where to start? Again, I'm big on simplicity. I'm big on eliminating most of the choices so that you can focus just on the very best uses of your time. And if you're thinking, how do I decide what to focus on after this presentation? I would say focus on the keystone habit. And a keystone habit is a routine or ritual that ripples into the rest of your life. It creates a cascade of good behavior. And so for myself, my keystone habit is working out. I know that if I work out, I get the benefits of exercise, sure. But I also tend to focus better. I have this period of high focus, the post-workout high for an hour or so afterward. I sleep better that night because I am tired and exhausted and have worked myself physically, which means I wake up the next day with better energy, which means I focus better then. And I also tend to eat better just because I feel like, I worked out, so I don't want to waste it. So I actually eat worse when I don't work out and eat better when I do. Now, at no point was I trying to build better nutrition habits or better focus or better sleep habits or improved energy, but all those things happen as a side effect as a result of the one keystone habit. Some other common examples of keystone habits, CEOs will often talk about their daily meditation habit. If they get 10 or 20 minutes of meditation in, then the rest of their day flows more smoothly. Artists, really big on a daily walk. There are tons of famous artists. There's a great book called Daily Rituals that talks about the habits and behaviors of many famous artists and scientists. And it's interesting how many of them had a daily walk as part of their routine. And then visualization. You'll hear from comedians or performers that often will visualize before they step out on the stage. But these are some examples of if you just do this one behavior, you can trust that it will ripple into other areas of your personal and professional life. All right, part 4, choice architecture. The basic idea here that I want to share with you is this idea of designing for laziness, okay? So BJ Fogg, the professor that I've mentioned throughout this presentation from Stanford University, he likes popcorn. He enjoys eating popcorn. He just didn't want to eat that much of it. And so he took the popcorn out of his kitchen, walked down the hallway and into his storage room, into his garage, climbed up on a ladder and put the popcorn on the highest shelf in the garage. Now, if he really wants to eat it, he can just go out and get it. It's only going to take 60 seconds. But if he's designing for his lazy decision, for his default action, he's not going to go get the popcorn. And so the idea is, how can we design the spaces we live in and the places we work so that the default action, the lazy behavior, is a better choice? I'll give you one example of a place that did this. Massachusetts General Hospital. So this is a drawing of the cafeteria inside the hospital. So the pinkish or reddish boxes, those are refrigerators that have soda or pop or Coke in them, okay? And then the squares that are not colored in, those are food tables. And then the two black squares on the sides are refrigerators with water inside of them, all right? So this is what the cafeteria looked like before the researchers came in. Then they changed it so that it looked like this, and I'll switch back and forth. Now, basically they added water stands around the food, and then they added water to the refrigerators by the cashier's register. Now, it's important to note that they did not remove the Coke or the soda entirely, all right? The pop was still available, but they just added water to the fridge. So that's it. That's all they did. And what they found was that soda sales decreased by 12% over the next 3 months, and water sales and water consumption increased by 25% over the next 3 months. So they changed people's behavior and habits. They never talked to anyone. They never incentivized anybody. They didn't motivate anyone. They just changed the environment where people ate. And often we come up with reasons afterward for why we do things. You know, if you were sitting in that cafeteria and you were drinking a Coke and I came up to you and asked you why, you would probably say, oh, well, this is what I felt like drinking. But the truth is, we often just pick up whatever is in front of us or placed in front of us because we're presented with that choice. So what choices are you presenting yourself or your team with at work or in your kitchen counter at home or in the spaces that you surround yourself in each day? There's a very famous equation called Lewin's equation about this. It basically just says behavior is a function of the person in their environment, and we can summarize habits in that way. The moral of this story, or the key idea, is that I've never seen a person consistently stick to positive habits in a negative environment. If you're trying to fight the environment that you live and work in all the time, it's going to be very, very hard to stick with the things that are important to you. All right, part 5, the final part, measurement. There's a man named Trent Dursmid, and he's a reader of mine, of my site, and so that was how I was put in touch with him. And he had a very interesting story. When he started his career, he was about 22, 23 years old, and he was a stockbroker. And no one was really expecting a whole lot of his performance. He was new at this bank that he was working at. He was young. But he ended up building over a $5 million book of business with a very simple strategy. And the simple strategy is what I call the paperclip strategy. So Trent would come into work each day, and he had 2 little bins on his desk. And in one bin, he had 120 paper clips, and then he would make a sales call, and he would take a paper clip and put it in the other bin, and then he'd make another one and do it every day until all 120 paper clips were moved over. And that was it. That was how he tracked his whole day. He didn't read analyst reports. He didn't look at the weather or the news. He didn't talk to other analysts about their investments or what was working well or poorly for them. He just focused on making sales calls. And I would argue that no matter what type of job you're working in, no matter what type of craft you or your company are focused on, we all have some kind of core behavior that we should be tracking like that. Something that isn't sexy, that's not going to get the attention of everybody, that doesn't make us feel like we're learning new things, that's just the work. But if you do the work consistently, you end up getting much different results. So this is Trent's quote about it. He just says, every morning I'd start with 120 paper clips in one jar, and I'd keep dialing the phone until I'd moved them all to the second jar. So what is keep dialing the phone for you, right? What is that behavior in your job or your startup or your business where you just need to be focused on doing the work repeatedly and more consistently than the rest of your peers? Trent had plenty of people he worked with that were smarter than him, that had more experience than him, but they didn't make the same number of sales calls each day, simply because they weren't focused on the volume and the behavior to the same degree that he was. So The other thing that we're talking about here is what I would call habit automaticity. And the basic idea is that the more repetitions that you perform, the more likely something becomes a habit and a behavior that you stick to in the long run. You have to perform a certain number of reps to get a new behavior to stick. And eventually you cross that habit line. On average, if you're wondering how long does that take, on average it takes about 66 days to build a new habit. But the range can be very wide. It can differ from 18 or 21 days for something small like drinking a glass of water at lunch, or it can be really, really long, like 8 months for a very complex habit like exercising 5 days a week. All right, I'd like to give you 2 final strategies for how to do this, for how to stick to this. The first strategy is what I call the Seinfeld strategy. Jerry Seinfeld, very famous comedian in the U.S., he was opening up, or he was on tour, doing a comedy tour, and there was a young comic named Brad Isaac who was opening for Seinfeld on stage that night. And he caught Seinfeld backstage before the show, and he said, "Mr. Seinfeld, I'm an aspiring comic, I'm a young comic. What tips do you have for a young comic on how to succeed?" And Seinfeld thought for a minute, and he said, "Well, the secret to being a better comic is to write better jokes. And the secret to writing better jokes is to write every day. So here's what you should do. Get a wall calendar where you can see every day of the month and the year mapped out on one page. Then, each day that you stick to your behavior of writing for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, writing jokes, I want you to put an X on that day. At the beginning, you'll do it every now and then, but eventually, at some point, you're going to get a string going, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 days in a row. You'll have a chain. And at that point, your only goal becomes don't break the chain. It doesn't matter how good or how bad the behavior is. It doesn't matter whether the writing makes it into the performance that you do. It doesn't matter how you feel about the jokes. All that matters is that you stick to the behavior. And this idea that sticking to the things that we want to measure over a consistent basis is what makes the biggest difference is something that I think ties into the point I tried to make at the very beginning of this, which is that 1% gains, when aggregated, add up to very significant results in the long run. So, the final idea that I'd like to share, so counting and measuring is important, and the final idea that I'd like to share is about feedback loops. There's a sign, I'm not sure if they have these in Hungary, they have them in the US, they're called your speed signs. So if you're driving down the road, it'll be like a radar and it'll say, this is the speed that you're going, right? So that sign is a feedback loop. And those feedback loops have been proven, researchers have shown that it decreases speed by about 10% on average, all right? And it sticks with drivers for miles or kilometers down the road. They stick with this behavior over the long run. And even better, if you see it 3 months or 6 months from now, even though you've seen it before, you're still going to have that type of behavior. You don't get fatigued by it. It still continues to work time after time. So this feedback loop, the reason it's important, some type of measurement like that, is that it acts as a trigger for your next behavior. It's a readout and it says, here's where you're at right now, and then it prompts you to perform the next habit. So, for whatever the habits are that you're focused on building, if you're going to do some kind of measurement, like the Seinfeld strategy or the paperclip strategy, it's important to have a feedback loop built in so that it prompts the next behavior that you're working on. Here are some examples. So I had a friend who wanted to work on posture and standing upright. Really hard to track that because you're just going to start talking and unless you're thinking about it every second of every day, eventually you start to slouch again. So what he did was he assumed good posture and put a piece of tape across his shoulder so that each time his shoulders would sag, it would tug and he would come back again. So it was a feedback loop for that. There's an outlet timer that you can buy. They're, $10 or so. And you plug it into the outlet and then you plug your device into the timer and you can set it for a particular time when it will shut off. So for example, if you're working late too many nights in a row, you can set it for 10 p.m. and when it gets to 10 p.m., the power is cut off. And so you basically are creating a feedback loop that says, this was important to you, remember, now this is cut off, you can't work anymore. In my car, I have a green light on the dashboard that whenever I'm driving in a fuel-efficient manner, it becomes more and more green. And whenever I'm accelerating or driving in a non-fuel-efficient manner, it changes to white. And so it acts as this feedback loop that's trying to prompt good behavior. And then there's another one called the glow cap, that basically when you're supposed to take your medication, it will glow to remind you that you need to open the bottle and take the medication. On average, these feedback loops create a 10% improvement. And so I would encourage you to think about how can we build feedback loops into the systems and habits that we're trying to build in the teams and in our personal lives. The moral of the story here is the best way to change long-term behavior is with short-term feedback. It's been a privilege to talk to you. We were only able to cover a certain amount of information in the small window that I had. If you're looking for more, I have a 45-page PDF that just kind of highlights a lot of these core concepts and adds some additional exercises on building new habits and behaviors. You can get that at jamesclear.com/habits. And how are we doing on time? Do we have time for questions? I don't know where we're at.
Is this on? Yeah, I think we have time for questions. Can we put the Slido up, please, guys? Okay, we have two.
Oh, here we go. On the aging study, what was the percentage of positive thinkers out of the 660 people in the sample? Good question. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but I can send that out. And actually, you know what? I'll put together a link. It'll just be at jamesclear.com/SC for Stretch Conference, and I'll have the links to the studies there if you'd like to read them. So jamesclear.com/SC. I'm wondering how to change reactions under stress, or let's see, like being under stress or boredom, eating chocolate, checking 9gag. Yeah, okay, good question. So it's interesting that you phrase the question that way. One of the common triggers for bad behaviors or negative behaviors is stress, boredom, or some type of loneliness. And so the best way to achieve not doing those things is by trying to look at the underlying cause of the stress or the boredom or the fatigue or loneliness and how you can address that. But assuming that that's a very complex issue that you don't want to think about or deal with right away, I'll give you a little hack that works. So basically it comes down to behavior design in a digital environment. So I talked about things like putting the paper clips on your desk at work or changing the environment of your kitchen counter at home. You can do the same thing on your screen. So let me show you the home screen. If not everyone will be able to see this, obviously. But if you're in the front row, so what's here on my home screen is just the icons at the bottom of the screen and then nothing else, okay? So if I want to get to anything, oh, there we go. This is great. I don't know who's doing that, but good work. So if I want to get to any apps like Instagram or whatever, I need to slide to the next screen to get to them, and then I have them nested inside of a folder. And then even stuff that I use even less, I just have in this extras folder on the third screen. But the point is, in order for me to use Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, I need to actually open up the phone and say, I want to go there, one swipe, two, and then click. And so I'm putting just a little bit more friction between me and the mindless behavior rather than just opening up the phone and being able to click it right away. So how can you increase the number of steps between you and mindless behaviors or unproductive behaviors? And then the second thing that you can do is install a couple pieces of software that will actually block those for a significant period of time. So the one that I use is called Freedom, and it's just at freedom.to, and you can set up a recurring block. So I have my email blocked from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. every morning. So I can't answer email until after 11 a.m., which means I get to spend the early hours of my day working on the things that are important to me rather than responding to everybody else's agenda. I also have a block set up, so I used Rescue Time to track the top 50 websites that I visit over any given amount of time, so I used it for a few months. Then I took those top 50 websites, dumped them all into Freedom, and created a recurring block from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m., and then it's open from 11 to 1, so around lunch I can browse and look at things, and then from 1 to 6 it's blocked again. So during the period of time during Monday through Friday when I'm supposed to be working, all of those sites are blocked. And there's something about taking the decision out of your hands and using software to make it more likely that you'll stick to those habits that makes it less fatiguing for yourself because it's not a decision to resist. It's just, oh, this is the environment that I'm in, so I might as well do the work. How do you handle triggers that make you unfocused, like starting or build, you have to wait for 5 minutes and then open the news page for 10 minutes? So triggers that make you unfocused. I think that, when I talked about priorities and simplification and elimination, being ruthless about focusing on those 5 things rather than the 25 things, that's the first step for me. Often when I'm unfocused, I find it's because I have like a brainstorming mind rather than a focused or narrow mind on the task at hand. So being really clear about the priorities makes it much easier for me to stick to the thing that I'm trying to work on. As far as triggers that make you unfocused, though, it's about simplification of the environment. So, the strategy that I just mentioned about eliminating those digital triggers, that's one. But physical triggers is another important thing for me. I don't have a photo of it. Sometimes I'll show it in a presentation of my desk. And it's pretty boring. I mean, there's nothing on it to prompt my behavior or drive me in a different way. I usually don't listen to music while I'm working. So it's basically trying to eliminate the amount of noise or signal in the environment so that I can just stay focused. Okay, is that all we have time for?
I think we're a little bit behind. So big round of applause for James.
Thank
please.
you. Thanks.
Really, really wonderful.